Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now when I was a wee fella, there was only 3 Star Wars movies, and a couple of cartoons, but we don't talk about those, and Caravan of Courage, come to think about that, but we don't talk about that one either. One of the cool things when I was a kid was Sandtroopers, or Desert Stormtroopers, because they kind of married up the idea that the Empire had to make do in some of the places that they would basically put down their forces. The Sandtroopers looked prepared, but worn, and I always loved that. Even as a kid, I thought it was really cool. So this fella here, he is a 3D print from Darkfire Designs. I'll make sure the link to that is in the description, but of course you can find these miniatures in other places too. So all of the paints will be listed in the description below for this one. Let's get started. So first things first, I've hit this fella with a primer spray of Brainmatter Beige from the Army Painter. Now I've used this for a couple of reasons. First off is the very faint bone touch it's got to it. You could use Wraithbone from Citadel just as well, but you could also use white. Honestly, by the time we're finished, the difference is going to be minimal. The second reason I've used this is that it was the first light primer I had when I put my hand out. So don't worry, don't sweat it too much if you haven't got this. White will do just fine. Now from this point, the first and probably largest thing to do is all of the black details. Now it's up to you here if you use contrast like I'm going to. This is Black Legion, although you can just as easily use a black acrylic. The reason why I'm using Black Legion is that this sucker just flows a little more easily, just feels like less work. Now try and be careful, when you're coming up to edges of areas that you want to stay white, but don't worry too much if you do splash them over, because we're able to go back with a little bit of Brainmatter Beige from the pot and tidy up as we need to. Now I have made a real pig's ear of that in some places, all over the back of his helmet, goodness me. But like I said, we're going to tidy that up, so don't worry if your application isn't perfect. What I've got now is Space Wolves Grey. It's another contrast color. I'm going to use this to fill in a few of the little divots and inlays on his helmet. Now, in reality, quote-unquote reality, these will appear a slightly more grey color, but by the time we have finished weathering and shading and all that, this is going to look a lot more accurate. They just have a very faint bluish tint in reality, and I want to lean into that a bit. Now, I've also used that to paint in the frown, the grill on the front of the helmet. You could do that in black. I've done it in black before, but I'm thinking this looks a little more accurate. What I'm going to use now is some Gryph-Hound orange for the pauldron. Now the colors of these things, if you want some guides, what I suggest is go check out 501st Legion's page on these pauldrons, because they've got huge amounts of extremely well-researched guides and suggestions and what have you for what color should be which. Canon tends to disagree with itself in a few places, but when I were a wee fella, the man in charge had an orange shoulder pad on Mos Eisley on Tatooine, so that's what I'm going to do. And that's done. Now at this point, we can start doing our tidy up. So grab yourself some Brainmatter Beige from the pot. Anytime you're using a spray, like a colored primer, it's always a good idea to get that color in a pot as well. So as you see, I'm just going up near the edges of anywhere that I've splurged with my black earlier on. Some areas you may find you want to give it a second coat, but for the most part, we're probably not going to need to. And once you're satisfied with that, there's really only one last thing to do, and it's to add a couple of the blue details that are on his pack. Now, the wonderful thing, you can see on a couple of the actual production versions of the pack that some of this was Tupperware. You can still see the logo. What I'm using here, this is Pastel Blue from Vallejo, but you could use something like Rust Grey. It's a very similar color. And you can check out a couple of pictures online for what parts are blue. There's not really very much of this. I think I might have the wrong one there, but oh well. Okay, so there is all of our base coats done, and he's ready for shading. Now ordinarily what I'd turn to here is good old marine juice. I've talked about that in a few videos. But the change that Citadel has done with the shades means that Nuln Oil works very differently to how it did when I first started mixing up marine juice. So we're going to fudge things a little bit because unfortunately the new one, well, it does work, but a lot of folks have mentioned that it doesn't work quite as well as what they've seen in the videos, which I want to make sure you're always getting to see, well, how I paint things, and if CITADEL changes the formulations, I'm going to catch up. So to try and match the original marine juice as closely as possible, what I've got here, this is equal parts Lahmian medium, new Reikland Fleshshade, and dark tone from the army painter. New Nuln oil isn't really dark enough, so sticking to dark tone, which is more of a true black. Let's see what happens. We're going to apply this generously over the entire miniature, and it's going to look real grimy going on, but I'll tell you what, from experience, this does look pretty similar to how old school marine juice would go on. So I might have just stumbled onto the right solution. So, yep, I'm going to bathe this dude in our shade mix here, and then we'll give him about half an hour to dry somewhere in the sun. Now, I'll admit, there is no satisfaction quite like having something work the first time you try it. So, brilliant! That marine juice replacement with the Nuln oil with the dark tone instead works perfectly. The Lahmian medium really is key to the flow properties of that mix, and I would suggest if you find it maybe a little bit darker than the old recipe was, just add a tiny bit more Lahmian medium. I'm happy with that though, that's brilliant. What I'm going to do is flip them around, and I've got that pastel blue from earlier, and a tiny, tiny, scraggly old brush. What I'm going to do is just lightly flick along the edges to catch some of those with a quick dry brush to give this pack a little bit more visual interest. I don't want to overdo it, and I'm not worried about it being blue because we are going to shade this with something else when we get to our weathering stage. Now there, as well as the backpack, which has come out quite nicely, I also dry brushed the pouches and his gloves, and that's going to work just fine. We don't need to do a huge amount of that to really make this work. What I've got here is a little bit of packing foam. Now you get these in blister packs and all sorts of things. You can do this step with a brush. It's best if it's a really scraggly old thing, but this works way better. So I've cut up my little packing foam into wee tiny cubes, and then popped it in between tweezers, goodness me. And I'm going back to my Brainmatter Beige. What we're going to do is, rather than painstakingly highlighting this, is just dabble on some little, oh goodness me, that might be a bit much. Just patches of this over the largest areas of the armor. So we want a fairly haphazard finish. And mind how you go when you come close to any joints which are going to stay black. Don't worry too much if you end up dipping into shaded areas, because those we're going to fix up as we go with a little bit of our weathering later. But for now, we're just brightening up some of the armor so that it looks properly sandblasted. Or like I mentioned, you can grab a scrankly old brush and snip the edges down until, rather than having a point, it's all a bit haphazard and gross. And then you can do the same thing and get a nice random stippled effect with the tip of that and a little bit more control. Yeah, see, we've brightened them up, but there are a few areas where I have dipped into my shading. But I'm not worried about that because we've got more to do. What I have here is brown sand from Vallejo, and this is very similar to something like Tau Light Ochre or maybe Deathclaw Brown. It is a little bit different to both of those, so again, it's dirt. Don't worry too much about the perfect color. What we'll do now is same thing again, just lightly dabbing at some areas where we want chipping, sandblasting, and collected dust on the armor. So in particular, anywhere that we have accidentally put our, our shading with white, you can tidy this up now. Now it is easy to go pretty overboard with this very quickly, so try and stick to areas that are likely to see a lot of wear.
If you do accidentally add too much of that, you can go back to your Brainmatter Beige and stipple that over in exactly the same way again. That's what I've done on his legs here, where I added just a little bit too much. But I have now some of that brown sand again, one wee dot of that paint, and about 15 to 16 drops of water. You really want this thin. What I'm going to do, looking at that, is actually thin that out a bit more. Okay, so that's 1 dot of paint to 20 drops of water. We're really looking for subtle here. And we'll start painting that into some of the crevices. Let's get them in shot here, where the sand and dust is likely to collect. So, in particular, up on these ridges. So one thing that will be handy for you is once you've put some on, just dab it at it with your finger. So you get a nice haphazard, really random effect. And you can put this over the black and such as well. Just try not to put too much of it on there. And you may even want to thin it down a little bit more before you do that, but that is up to you. Again, smudge it away where you feel you need to, particularly up on top of the helmet. This is a really handy one. Wee bit of this, and then dip dip dab. And then, one more time, if you're not liking how that's looking, just grab your Brainmatter Beige and water it down a little and tidy up some of the panels a bit. So think about areas that you'd be able to easily reach and just swipe grime away from. So the backs of his legs, for example, I'm probably going to leave pretty grubby, but some of these areas, let's tidy them up just a little with that Brainmatter Beige. Now layering over back and forth with your bone color and your dirt and your dust is going to give you a textured finish. I really like how it works on this particular style of armor. I think it looks a little more, dare I say, realistic. But what we're going to do now is to varnish them. Now I'm using here Instar's Varnish Plus because it's the business. Just jam a little bit of this on over the entire miniature. It's always a good idea to protect your work, particularly if you are using contrast. They recommend that it is varnished because it can lift off if you are not careful. But the other reason to varnish your miniatures is quite often that it will change how light interacts with the miniature. And that's not always 100% necessary, but sometimes it'll work in your favor. And particularly, I find a nice matte varnish will bring things together really nicely. Now, to my eyes, varnish is when a miniature is really finished because it does such interesting things to it. There is one last step though. And looking at this fella here, if I needed to come back with any black and tidy up his blaster, that's when I do it. Because, well, it doesn't matter where you are. If you're in the mud, the muck, the dust and the dirt, your blaster needs to fire. So if you're ever doing like really professional military stuff, doesn't matter how the rest of the gear looks, that weapon needs to be clean. But what I've got here is a pencil. This is a B pencil, something nice and soft. What I'm going to do is lightly run it along the edges of detail just to catch a little bit of silver and get a groovy and very easy highlight. Now once I'm done with this, I'm going to pop some Vallejo Brown Earth onto his base, dry brush that with a little bit of dark sand, and get a look at what he looks like when he is all finished.
And there at last, our Desert Trooper, or Sandtrooper, is complete. And these guys are still so cool. You know, they're everything I like about that really mechanical and industrialized method of warfare and control that the Empire posits, but with the practicalities of these wildly disparate planets that they've got to go and conquer. So I love the look of the Sandtroopers. They've always been one of my favorites. So thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. If you've got any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.